So, yeah, I mean, I guess we'll be talking mainly about, or we're talking about your kind of large-scale international collaborations, and specifically the two examples that are most interesting to me, which are the prospect theory and the temporal discounting papers. Briefly before that, I always look at people's CV and that kind of stuff, and it seemed like initially it seemed like you were mainly interested in why people hate stats. That seemed to be, you have several papers on stats anxiety. So I was curious, so it seemed to me there's two obvious reasons why you would study that. One is either you love stats and you don't understand why other people don't love it. So it's you want to understand it, or you hate stats and it's kind of more, you want to express that through research. So yeah, I'm curious, why study that? And then also, how did you end up doing this more recent research?
Absolutely. So no, it's a great question. And it's actually a great observation, because I raise this all the time to people when I mention it. I actually frame it in the same way you did. The first interesting thing is that I didn't actually apply for the PhD that I did. I didn't apply for any PhD. What happened was I got interested in going to graduate school and had looked into going overseas. I thought I would try something different, try a bit of a change. I had started out planning to be an American football coach. I had played American football in university and had all this. And then one day I just decided that really wasn't the trajectory I wanted. I thought I'd try something else. So ended up looking into graduate school options overseas, and had really just applied for a master's program in general psychology. Didn't have anything specific. And the department I had applied to essentially put my name into a list of candidates for a PhD program because they didn't even offer a master's. So they just put my name into a pile, and I got a phone call, if you can imagine, back when, a regular landline phone call at about 4:00 in the morning. It was on the 4th of July, interestingly. It was about 4:00 in the morning, and that was when the panel had met in Belfast. And the first question they asked me in this interview panel was, why did I want to do a PhD? And I pretty honestly was like, it's not really something that interests me. The interview was a little bit messy for a while. It didn't, as you can imagine, I wasn't necessarily thinking academic trajectory or anything. And what ended up happening was, at one point they asked me if I had any questions or thoughts based on the discussion. And the question I asked was simply, what do PhD students do? Do they get a chance to teach when they're PhD students? Because in the States, it's very common that PhD students get to teach. And I mentioned the reason I was curious about this was because as an undergrad, I'd been asked to help with essentially an overflow of statistics undergrad students by my stats professor. I hadn't been a top student, but I had been a really engaged student, and I got along really well with that professor, and I found him very motivating and all this. And I had mentioned that as an undergrad, I was asked to help teach a statistics class, and I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I got along great with it. I found it was really cool, and something that was really engaging for me to work with fellow students on, because there were people I knew, and I really enjoyed it. And in that interview, you could hear all the jaws dropping and hitting the table in that moment, because their experience had been psychology students hate statistics, full stop. And they were very excited that someone not only enjoyed it, but enjoyed the idea of teaching it, because apparently in that department at the time, that was the class that they gave to basically punish somebody, or some new professor, or somebody who basically didn't want that. That was the class they kind of required them, was to teach the stats classes. And so I had said, yeah, I really enjoyed it and all that. And they kind of floated this topic in me. I'm kind of cutting out some of the random details in the middle, but it didn't all happen right in one exact moment. But essentially, eventually they floated me this idea of, would you be interested in doing a PhD in essentially statistics anxiety, or why psychology is such a place for such dislike towards statistics? And I ended up thinking that's a great idea. Like I was shocked that anybody didn't like statistics. I had really enjoyed it. Felt like I learned a lot. It really clicked with me, and I could see all the applications for it. So it was really more the interest in why people weren't learning, not purely educational, but just what was this apprehension, and it almost seemed anemic to a lot of people. When I started working on that, and I spent 3 years basically studying now we looked at psychology undergraduates, but it was broader than that. This was back in the day when you could get away with doing a PhD that only tested psychology undergrads. But in my case, it made sense, because psychology students should be the most inclined to care about this subject. And what happened was, I started realizing there's much broader implications for this, because some of the things we found, yes, there's issues with teaching and issues with people not quite grasping it and so on, or, having a bad, not in their previous experience with math wasn't positive or something. But there were some bigger ones that related to people just don't understand what statistics really is, right? And I started realizing this has much larger implications. So there's a much broader issue with people not understanding and not wanting to understand risk, uncertainty, probability, significance, variability, or even just kind of the standards of distribution, so data dispersion. This basic kind of information tends to be something a lot of people don't want to know. Now, this is 20 years ago. Now, I don't think we have quite the same issue because with things like AI and, the idea of analytics and the fact that so many people have so many different reasons to think about or care about data, it's probably changed a little bit and people now see more of the value. But 20 years ago, even people in social sciences and, various academic fields saw statistics as a burden because a lot of it was taught through programs like SPSS, where you were basically taught about pointing and clicking things. You weren't really engaging in learning.
Yeah, I mean, your description is basically exactly what I also felt, I think, when I did my psychology undergraduate, where there was the sense like there's these things I want to learn and things I want to find out and things I want to do. And then I guess you have to like jump through these hoops to do the stats. It seemed like this kind of like vaguely unnecessary, slightly not, I didn't find it like super complicated, but it's just like annoying and just something you had to get done in that sense. But I think, for me, it was also like just actually doing my own research. At some point, you do reach that point where you go like, now I see, now I get it. Like I'm starting to understand the point of it. But I think you basically described very accurate, like very precisely what I felt in the sense of like, yeah, this vague sense of like, why do we even need this without really asking it, though, in my case. It's just kind of just background annoyance.
Absolutely. And I think that was the prevailing view in a lot of disciplines. And I think it even spoke to the general public outside of academia. I think it was a much broader issue. And so essentially, I worked on that for several years and even collaborated with people in different countries who had similar kind of challenges with their own students or in just kind of the general public. And I just started seeing the link to that I started seeing that this challenge isn't just something that relates to how it's taught in undergraduate psychology curriculum, but it's a much broader social issue, because if such a large part of society doesn't grasp basic understanding of things, essentially everything can basically be missed out or misunderstood on simple understanding, simple probabilities, simple risks and uncertainties. And that applies to so much, right? People love to reflect on, Wall Street or stuff, but a lot of basic uncertainty and risk and all applies to everything we do every day, whether or not we're even thinking about it. So the idea that we should be better at understanding even the fundamentals, it's a pretty easy argument to make, and it's an easy leap to go from why it's a problem in classrooms to much bigger challenges. And so it really wasn't a hard link over. I spent several years working on a lot of different topics and kind of dabbling in various different spaces, but that wasn't so much because I lost interest on the statistics anxiety side. It was because I really wanted to understand broader kind of concepts of public policy challenges and broader questions we could ask as it related to understanding risk, uncertainty, general statistics, and the application of it. So it wasn't so much that I pivoted greatly from my PhD. It's that I saw that was a very contained way to understand something that was a much wider challenge that we face. So students understanding or not understanding statistics in a psychology degree, that's one thing, and it's not nothing, and it's certainly important to our discipline. But it was a much larger topic than that. So it really was only that I expanded it away, and so the frame looks different. But essentially, you're still talking about the same kind of things. How do people understand fundamentals of risk, uncertainty, probability, and so on, and how does that apply to any number of different challenges and decisions we face?
Mm-hmm. So I know of the two articles that we want to discuss today, the prospect theory one was the first one. How do you get then from these, initially probably fairly small lab studies you did, or you mentioned some international collaborations there also, but then how do you get to these kind of big studies with, 50 labs in 50 countries or whatever it is?
Yeah, so there's kind of a two level answer to that. And the first level is my research interests really started evolving and expanding, again, outside of just looking at within our discipline, and really started looking at these broader, big social challenges, really interested in the public policy side. But around that same time, so in 2011, I launched, along with some others, this international researcher program for early career researchers. At the time, it was kind of more student focused. And essentially, it was an opportunity for early career researchers and students who had come from places where they didn't get many opportunities to engage in active research projects while they were students, whether it was undergrad, master's, or in some cases, PhD. And we set up this program to build small international teams to run their own studies, and we would give them the support to run this. It was called the Junior Researcher Program. And essentially, we started developing that, and it used to be small teams of around 6 to 7 people. So they would run these kind of studies that were led by a PhD student or a postdoc in 6 or 7 countries, and it developed. We also started adding in, at the time, what we called an internship, which was hosted by my former institution in Cambridge. And we would bring everybody in at the end who wanted to, and we would work on one of these kind of international collaborations. In the early years, we were really feeling it out. We were trying different things. We were running studies. I wouldn't have called them quite what we're doing now and what we've learned over time, but they were still kind of large collaboration, multi-country studies. But we weren't really asking fundamental questions. We weren't retesting major theories or trying to expand these kind of major questions. They were really kind of really contained things. I was early career and we were mostly with students, didn't have a whole lot of experience with it. But we looked at a lot of different things like healthcare decisions between countries. How do people make decisions about their health and understanding risk in those contexts? We looked at the policy challenges, and we really kind of tried to apply it to a different theme each year. Then we started realizing that there were broader values to this. So as more and more organizations started understanding the role of behavioral science in applied policy, in institutional settings, in real world contexts, whatever they might be, we started realizing there would be some use in translating a lot of that evidence for general audiences. So we started writing as these big collaborations rather than running individual and original studies. We'd write policy reports that tried to translate findings. That led to being invited to put together an entire textbook on the role of behavioral science in public policy. So we put an entire textbook together on it. The first year we did that was 2017. So that obviously it takes a while to put a book together, but it came out, I believe, in 2019. So what happened was while we were working on that, this is really when, I wouldn't say the peak of the replication crisis, but the beginning of the wave where people started looking for solutions, not just identifying issues that might exist. So there was more interest in trying to say, well, what are the methods necessary to really reliably test questions that we have in psychological science, particularly as it relates to behavior and decision making. So as those questions really started pushing along, there was, let's say, pushback on almost every major psychological theory you might think exists, or those that we pretty much all learned in our field at undergrad, right? Well, one of the ones that's really important if you care about things like risk and uncertainty, and if you care about understanding the probability and their applications in public policy, one of the most fundamental ones is loss aversion. Around that time that the book was coming out, I believe it was in 2018 or so, maybe possibly 2017, somewhere in there, 2017, 2018, some work came out basically saying loss aversion was fallacy. It's the biggest myth in the whole field, and it wasn't a real thing. And this is quite a dramatic claim to make, as you can understand. So claiming that one of the most fundamental and largely agreed on constructs isn't a thing certainly piqued our interest because we had just written how many examples that essentially rely on assuming that loss aversion is a real thing. So we looked through it. We weren't super impressed by the argument saying it wasn't real. It seemed more just like a disagreement as to what things explain what. But I don't want to go into a whole long thing on that. We weren't super impressed by the argument. But we did think, you know what, that is a really important question, though. If we're working on the assumption that loss aversion is real, and we talk about all these cases that essentially rely on that, we probably should have some confidence that what we're saying is based on what we know, not just something that's generally accepted. So we looked at different options for doing that. Now, we've been asked, and you alluded to, about why we didn't just do something new, something more 21st century test of loss aversion, rather than go back and run the 1979 method and retest that. Well, the reality is we did think about that, and it was discussed and it was considered, but there was a pretty strong prevailing view that we didn't actually think there was any evidence saying loss aversion wasn't real. We actually thought that plenty of the modern methods showed pretty well that loss aversion is a really it's a very real thing. It's not universal. It doesn't apply to everyone in all contexts, but that there are plenty of real world examples that essentially validate this is a useful frame. I'll do a quick aside on this and point out, and I'll bring this up repeatedly. One of the biggest flaws I think we have right now is debate around the field seems to be whether something universally applies or it's wrong. And I think this is a really problematic way to go about behavioral science generally, or any sort of, really just any sort of psychological field, that even economics and many social disciplines, the idea of having a frame for a theory doesn't mean it has to universally apply. It means it has to be a useful standard so that we can test deviations from it. So one of the things that we looked at was, is there anything that suggests loss aversion isn't real from all the more modern ways of testing it? And we just weren't convinced. So we saw this complaint saying it wasn't real, but in our view, at the time certainly, was we don't think they've made a compelling argument. And we also think that there are plenty of modern ways that this has been tested in real world settings and just deeper, laboratory tests that have shown that it's a very real frame. Again, not universal, doesn't always apply to every person in every context, but that it's a very good descriptive baseline against which you can test deviations, right? It's the same thing like with anything economic. Supply and demand is not absolute and universal. There are times when higher prices can drive demand, right? And we see this all the time, daily. So it's not the idea that something has to be universally applied to be true. So the reason we ended up going back to the original is because we thought, well, there's actually plenty of validation of this. And what would be better was to say, what if we went back to the original descriptive model? Because remember, and we'll talk about what prospect theory really is, I guess, but one of the critical things to remember is it's meant to be a descriptive model. It is not meant to be a universal predictor, an explainer of all human behavior and decision-making related to uncertainty. And I think this was what was critical to us, is why don't we just go back to that and say, if you would come to the same conclusion, if we tested this again, we tweak some things that we think could have been, now that we know what we know, could be, add some robustness to the study. If we did that, we would be able to say, what are the strengths and which things don't really tend to, what don't seem to necessarily apply again, or don't apply broadly. So that's why we went back to the original, is because we didn't actually see this dramatic need for something else, because there was plenty of something else's. The question was really going back to, would the theory still look the same if we tested it again now? And so that was why we went back to the 1979 when we decided that was the way to go.
I mean, I guess my question to some extent is that I think I wrote this down in my notes somewhere, which was something like, is this a test of prospect theory or more a test of like how much we can trust Kahneman Tversky in 1979, right? So because I don't know, I think I'm not as critical of loss aversion, and we don't need to turn this into a debate about that. I think I'm more critical than you are, but not as critical as some of the other people. And I guess my point is more like the original prospect theory had, maybe you can get into a bit more detail later, but the questions that you then also asked that you tried to replicate were very simple yet binary questions, right? And then you look at proportions of people who say yes or no. And it just seems to me it's like so antithetical to the way that most modern science to some extent is done. And that, I mean, maybe, I'm jumping around a bit now, but one question maybe that I have right now on this is like, was also one reason you did this just because it's very easy to do and quick to do in lots of places, rather than setting up a 1.5 hour laboratory experiment?
I mean, I think jokingly we may have said that, but I wouldn't have called it easy because, as you may recall, we did this in a lot of different countries, in a lot of different languages. And so the difference isn't so much that it would be easy, but trying to do something like that with a direct observation of behavior, while also being able to control for the many confounds that would exist beyond just translating the language, but changing the different context. One of the things that we actually thought was more useful was to say, so if you go back and read the 1979 paper, there's a lot of things that probably wouldn't get through peer review now, not the work itself, but the ambiguities of what was explained. Like, if you go back and read it, see if you can figure out how many participants actually completed the whole study, or what statistical tests were run. It's kind of presumed they were all chi-squared tests because of the nature of the data they were working with. It's not in there. The other big thing, and this shocks people, do you know what term is not in that paper? Loss aversion. Loss aversion is not in that paper originally, right? Now, it's not that dramatic of one, except we are academics. Our job is often to be pedantic and critical about semantics. And one of those things is the term loss aversion doesn't appear in the 1979 paper. And we knew going into this that that was going to be a concern. Are we really challenging, is loss aversion being backed up by this, or are we doing something else? So we put that very explicitly in the article when we wrote it up. But the critical thing, and the reason we decided on this, was Kahneman Tversky's big change was providing the 6 frames in the prospect theory framework, right? They have this descriptive model, and it gives 6 frames of understanding things that don't look like what we used to expect. And what that means is, for a long time, the prediction was expected utility theory, right? We have this base understanding of the value of different choices, the probability of a good outcome, and we pick the one where those things line up the best, right? I'm giving a very simplified explanation because I'm going to guess most of your audience is familiar with it, and I don't want angry hate mail if I give somebody's the version that somebody doesn't like of it. So I'm going to give the most generic possible one. In any case, so they provide these 6 different frames that relate to things like certainty, the inverting losses and gains, magnitude differences, reframing the same things, switching up the way information was presented, right? So we just retested all of that. We used all the frames that we could use without getting too complicated, but we tried to do it in a way that would pass 2019 peer review standards, not 1979 peer review standards. Now, I will always say that this one thing. I do not like revisiting standards from 50 years before, so long as we're not talking about ethical differences, right? Ethics is different. Like, if we want to talk about ethics in Milgram, that's fine. I don't think that. But when we're talking about what Kahneman Tversky did, I don't find any value in criticizing them. Oh, they didn't know to produce this thing, or they didn't have this chart. I mean, back in those days, you had to send your data off to someone to run on a computer, right? And they had to plug in a ticket into a supercomputer or a Crash or whatever they were to manipulate data and then have a result. So I don't think there's any value in criticizing. All it is fair to say, though, is if you go back to the 1979 paper, there are some gaps that today you wouldn't be allowed to do, okay? And it's simple things like, where were their participants, right? Were they in Israel, Sweden, or the States? Because the paper kind of alludes to all 3. What value of money was presented? We know in some cases it was Israeli shillings, right, at the time. Or Israeli pound, I think it was shilling.
Is it shekels?
But shekel. Is it shekel or shilling? Anyway, whatever the currency was in late 70s of Israel. And it's talked about in these ways, but we know they were in these different countries because it's alluded to in the paper, but there's specifics that are missing. What is the significance level? How many people actually participated in each of the experiments, right? So we thought we can, these are easy things that we can correct for, and we can resolve this, but also we can get a much larger sample, and we can get a much more varied sample in different places with different economic systems. It's critically different certainty and safety net systems, because your willingness to, take on risk might have a lot to do with the environment that you're in. Can you survive risk, right? And just lots of different contexts. So that way we can have a more varied sample around it and say, would we have come to the same conclusion that they came to then? Okay. And that's why we decided on it, because we felt there was enough under the modern testing methods to talk about the broader loss aversion. But prospect theory, going back to that original, we felt we could give it this kind of modern update on and use this great network that we have. So that's why we did that study. We also had this great network of early career researchers. So we had a lot of different, we had representatives and researchers from a lot of 19 different countries. I think we started with a few more and kind of lost a few along the way. But we ended up with 19 different countries, and we were able to test 17 of the questions out of their original 20, I believe. There were a few that we dropped just because for translatability issues and some other things, it just didn't make much sense, and different kind of systems might have confounded the results anyway. So we stuck with the ones that we could definitely do in different countries and where we could produce uniform comparative financial values. We wanted to make sure that we weren't ballparking the differences in financial values, but we could make them directly the same relative values. So that was worked on, and we updated to match 2019 economic standards. So the reason we did all that is getting this great variability, having this robust method, and then the real question is, would we have come to the same conclusion? Okay. Now, if you focus only on the replication aspects of it, you come out and you say, well, we probably would have come to the same conclusion. but it's probably not for the reasons most people think. And this is actually one of the downsides of doing a paper that has the term replication in it, especially because lots of people wanted it to be true. I'll be honest with you. We had a lot of people, when they found out we were doing the study, wanted it to be true. Do you know who was the most supportive without any concern whether or not it was right? Danny Kahneman. He was wonderful. And I want to be very clear and upfront about that. The very kind words of encouragement that he shared without any sort of biasing or any sort of try to push to get anything done in any way. He said, I think this is a wonderful idea. And I just think he deserves that credit because, no prior reason for him to think, somebody running this test with all these international people. And certainly, let's be honest, a lot of the rhetoric now seems to be more people wanting to cut down past ideas. So I want to say he was actually extremely supportive of it, as was Hugo Sonnenschein, who was the editor of Econometrica in 1979. He wrote a very nice email or two trying to help us see if we could find some records that had gone missing over the years. So they were great. But the big reason that I think we would come to the conclusion isn't just the direct replication values, because if you look at our chart and how it compared to the 1979 values, other than the attenuation, so the kind of smaller effects in some cases, which you would expect, we had a much larger sample. The attenuation in some cases, that's really the only place we didn't find pretty solid replication. But there's a bigger one, and it's the table that a lot of people didn't look at because they just wanted to jump to saying, oh, it replicated, so we're good. If you look at the replication tables, those are fine. But there was a really interesting one that I think a lot of people missed out on, and it was figure 5 in the article. And figure 5 in the article shows very directly how much of the result that we found could be explained by prospect theory, but not explained by expected utility theory, right? And then we went one further where we said neither one of them. And that's figure 5. And it shows very clearly the reason we would have come to the same conclusion in 1979 as we did in 2019. The reason we've done it is because, again, this descriptive model gave us way more than expected utility theory did. It was not perfectly and universally explanatory. It just gave us a ton more information and a much better way to understand and describe decision-making than what was prevailing at the time. And I think that is the important thing. There's been this great new work coming out. And there's a lot of new things talking about either agency in decision-making and also this complexity work by Oprea. I think these things are great debates that we should be having. I think they're wonderful. What I don't care that much about, though, is anybody saying something wasn't perfectly explanatory, because no model is ever going to be perfectly explanatory. Kahneman himself talked about noise, right? Some things just end up there because they end up there. And this was one of the exciting things about the work that we did. The reason we would come to the same conclusion isn't just because most of the effects were essentially as they were in 1979. It's because they again explained a ton more than the prevailing theory at the time. We're not even going to say expected utility theory was wrong. We are going to say that as a baseline model, it doesn't explain as much deviation as prospect theory does, right? With prospect theory, you can get so much more and you still have deviation from the model. That is one of the main reasons we wanted to run that study. And I was very proud that we got to that point of it, but we could present it. I'll be openly honest with you. I didn't anticipate a failed replication. I didn't pick it because I thought it was going to be that way. I picked it because we had just done a whole book on the assumption loss aversion was a real thing, and loss aversion being in core based on prospect theory. Well, we better go back and validate whether or not that's even true. If it had been wrong, we would have said it. And in fact, as you've probably seen in a lot of it, sometimes there's more incentive in finding an existing theory wrong than validating it's right. But that's essentially why we went with it. And there was a great deal of interest in that work, and we were very thankful to the kind of positive reaction we got to the method and the approach that we took. Obviously, there were the complaints that why did we just test it again? But for me, a lot of it was shifting the goalposts. Our job was, would we have come to the same conclusion in 1979? And our answer was yes. Some attenuation of effects, some minor variations. The replication effect difference between countries was very interesting. I don't want to speculate on it, but I think that's very interesting that in some countries, I believe Chile was the lowest replication rate overall. Bulgaria and Chile were the lowest. Interesting. I'm not going to speculate what that might mean, but it's a very interesting thing nonetheless. But if you look at it, there's a distribution of effects. So somebody has to be the lowest. Okay. So I'm not going to speculate if you find a decent distribution. So that's basically the backstory of how we did prospect theory, why we chose to do it the way we did. The group was wonderful, almost entirely early career researchers from the junior researcher program. It was a hot summer that year in Cambridge, and which is not a normal thing you say about the UK. At least it used to not be. So we had a lot of effort in some very hot rooms that weren't set up for hot summers, but a great experience overall.
Yeah, I love that Kahneman was supportive of it, and it seems to be very much in agreement with everything I've basically read about him. That it's like very supportive of, he said, I think him and some other people coined this term of the adversarial collaboration or whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing, where you basically, if someone disagrees with you, you create an experiment together that tests which one of you is correct, and you both have to agree with the design, basically.
If you don't mind, I'll take a lead from that and just give a very minor little gripe about our field. Okay, minor gripe. We actually sought adversarial collaboration, and what we found was
for this project.
For that project and since, we actually tried to find some people who were strong, and what we had found was there weren't that many people that were adversarial that were collegial. We found that they didn't want to engage in the scientific debate. They wanted to criticize. We actually sought it for a few of our studies where we wanted to find people who disagreed. And honestly, a lot of the blowback or the feedback we got from those people was more just anger at the work. We wanted people who disagreed with it. We thought, let's put it through. For me, I would have been very shocked if it hadn't replicated, but I wasn't going to hide if it didn't, right? But we actually sought it, and we got mostly, the reactions we got were mostly bemused, I guess. But there was no interest in actually having an adversarial collaboration. There was interest in criticizing. And I think that's a problem for the field, because I think adversarial collaboration is ideal. The idea of working with people that you have disagreement on, so you say, well, then we should come up with a way that it answers for both of us, that we agree this way will answer our question. And we didn't really get a lot of that. We certainly had some people who shared some very useful critique, but we didn't get as much of that as we would have liked, to be honest with you. We would have loved some people in the study that were collegially adversarial, not just cynical, right? And I think cynicism isn't particularly helpful.
Yeah, there's a difference between being critical and adversarial and just being a dick. I don't know whether that was the case exactly in your case, but I can roughly imagine it. Yeah.
Yep. Kahneman has no reason to be as supportive to me as he was. I wasn't one of his students. I have no link to Princeton. I was overseas at the time. I hadn't lived or been a professional in the States in a decade. So he had no real reason to have any kind of faith in my interest. And, certainly plenty of people were being much more critical about it. And yet he was the most supportive one. And in my view, that's collegial adversarial collaboration, right? He didn't have any role in what we did. The big large scale study we did the year later was a bit of a pivot. But in that case, we actually worked with the original authors, and they had to basically put themselves out on a limb to work with us, but know that they didn't get the final say, and we were testing the replication of their whole thing on meta perception and polarization. It's a different topic than decision making, but one we felt was important at the time. But Jeff Lees and Mina Takara, they were wonderful, and again, they had no reason and they had no say over it. That was an excellent one. I wouldn't have called it adversarial as much as just collaborative, but we were replicating their method in a bunch of countries, and they didn't get a final say over any of it. So those things, you can tell very quickly who's really committed to the knowledge idea and who just enjoys being cynical.
Do you find that by itself is a good predictor of the replicability? I mean, this is obviously a bit speculation, but...
Sample size is too small, but I'd say it more predicts how people are going to comment when we post the final results. We've only tested up to now, we've only tested things that we felt were like, the only things that we've really focused on replicating, because we want to do broader work than just replicate for the sake of replication. I don't think there's that much value in replicating for the sake of replication. Maybe there were some times where this was the case, but in most cases, I think replicate things that are hugely impactful and make sure that we can have trust in them. Just rolling something out and asking more people to participate in a study, if it's not having any major influence, I'm less motivated for. Our sample size is rather small of studies we've done that for, because there's very few theories that we give that much trust and credit to. That's why we ended up doing temporal discounting as well, because that is a hugely influential framework. But we only tested it for the same reason we essentially tested prospect theory. It matters. It is a core assumption in what we do. Therefore, it matters that we can be confident that it applies in the way we think it applies. And I think that our sample size is too small to say if that's every single one, but certainly it gives us some idea that if you go after the things that you rely on and you go into them relying on them based not just on a paper or some pop psychology article or some mainstream thing, or I don't know, somebody on LinkedIn who is selling consulting work from it. I think if you really rely on these in your work, that probably is a better predictor of replicability. But cynicism, I don't know, high cynicism of popular ideas, it could go either way, I guess.
Yeah, but do you have then, especially, this is my assumption, that these projects take a lot of time, and it's not something you just want to, casually do a random project. Do you have like a list, like a hierarchical list of like, next I want to do that, and then I'm going to do this project, or have you done the ones you want to do, or how do you kind of decide which one to do next in that sense? Is it just,
Yeah, so we didn't originally. We tested prospect theory because that seemed critical to test at that time. That was a really important claim that we thought was important. The one sense we found that our model for running these high quality or kind of high sample size studies was producing pretty quality data, and we saw a lot of feedback, really critical feedback from a lot of people saying, "Do you think this works?" And you don't want to ask and take the time of that many researchers to do and that many participants if you don't feel really good about your method, right? You need to say, we're not just asking people to fill this in so we can say our sample size was this size. Okay, right. It's great to have those sample sizes. But no, our hierarchy has always been, is there something specifically that seems of significant value to test at such a large scale that you can understand the distribution of this concept on a quote unquote global level? Global being, I actually asked one of the former editors at Science how to define global, because you see some things and it's like 3 countries and other things that are 50 and other things that are, as many countries as the UN or the WHO can get involved. And I was like, what level can we call something global? But in our case, it was just at what point is something important enough to test in enough countries that we can say this concept or this framework does seem to apply broadly. It is not just something that's Western or American or whatever. And so we've had a few of those. We've evolved it over time too. It was never intended to be, a bunch of research students and early career investigators just running my studies for me. That's why we evolved it out where I don't lead these anymore, and another person has taken over. And even she has devolved it further to other people choosing on it. But essentially the decision point was not just what should we replicate, because replication wasn't really our goal in and of itself. It's what major questions are out there that there'd be tremendous value in running these at such a scale. And that's where we've really focused on doing this. Prospect theory is one, temporal discounting is one. These were clear ones, right? And we've done some other ones, questions about policies around climate change and who should make those decisions. We've done some on who should regulate the internet, these kind of things. These aren't necessarily my particular interests. The program kind of evolves from there. But those are obviously really important questions that asking in a lot of places has specific value. So essentially, you're replicating your own work as you do it, right?
About your point about what counts as global, I mean, one thing I noticed is that, if I remember correctly, is that between the discounting and the prospect theory one, you added quite a lot more of the world. I think the prospect theory is mainly Western world plus China and Chile, I believe. And then the discounting one involves 5-6 countries in Africa, I believe, more of like Southeast Asia or Australia, or Oceania and that kind of stuff, right? And much more South America also. Was that like a deliberate choice to really try and push into new countries that you haven't covered at all? Or was it kind of just a byproduct of you doing this work and more people being interested in being involved?
That's a great question. I mean, it's a bit of all of the above. The first year was the first time we did it, so we couldn't really go around asking, research. Again, I'm big on the ethical side for both the investigators and the participants, that I think I don't like wasting people's time. And I think it's inappropriate to run studies if you're not pretty confident in the way you approach them. So because of how the prospect theory one went and what we've learned since, we've felt more comfortable inviting people and doing more. We don't quite do open calls. We do a little bit of an open call for researcher. I found some issues when we did a straight open call because of how do you establish some ethical standards with that. But one of our real things was we want more groups involved. We want to get broader representation within and between countries, right? And so what we found was as those papers were pretty well received, at least in terms of methodology, more and more people were aware of the work we were doing. We got contacted by people directly, and then we had a stronger network of people who had worked with us, saw how we operated, saw that we seemed to at least have some clue what we were doing with running these studies, and that seemed to attract a lot more interest in engaging from many places. We certainly have done everything we can to engage collaborators from just about every country. The current one we're running right now is kind of back closer to my core research interest. It's not specifically a program, but through that broader network of investigators around the world. We have over 21,000 participants in that one, but we have over 150 that have done it in Yemen because we had 2 researchers in Yemen who really wanted to be part of it, and we've worked with them. So you talk about there are researchers who want their countries to be part of these studies, right? And if we can work with them and we have the ability to engage with them safely and ethically, then we try to, where it's possible. The bigger challenges tends to be you have resource limitations, time and testing limitations, and there's other things as well that can be a barrier to this. But essentially, anytime we've been able to find collaborators in or from countries, we've tried to work with them. And we've tried to expand that. And we've identified specific countries in the past where we were very close but couldn't quite engage with them. And it's been productive. And it's built a lot of relationships. We've had some that there have been issues that have stopped, our ability to collaborate with them. But right now we have one going that I believe we have over 90 countries signed up. It probably won't end up with 90 in the final study, but it will be, we're already over, I think, 80 that have collected a significant amount of data. So in these cases, I don't mean to get such a serious tone, but yes, we absolutely try to work with as many as possible. Sometimes it's not possible for various reasons. And sometimes we just, collaborators drop off. People realize they didn't have the time to engage, but we try to engage as many as possible. And we don't do any sort of questioning, do you agree with this or do you expect to replicate it? We just, collaborators are collaborators. We don't really, lean into one view or another in terms of should they be adversarial or should they be on, there's no real line on that. We just want to engage with many as people as we can.
Yeah, I mean, that by itself sounds like enough work to begin with. Yeah, but I mean, without getting like too technical into the governance of a project like this, but I'm just curious, it sounded like it started off relatively small or something, if I understand correctly. This is basically the continuation of what you started, right, quite a while back. And now it's grown into this, it sounds like there's lots of people involved. I mean, you already mentioned that you're maybe not quite as involved with it as you were in the beginning, if I understood you correctly. But kind of how does it? I guess what I'm curious is how it works, basically, how the everyone decides on the next study and how to get new people and whether they're trustworthy and when to start and what exactly the methods are and all that kind of stuff. I'm just curious how that practically works.
So the program, the junior researcher program, and then this eventual sister program that Columbia University supported me to launch when I relocated here, these programs are still run. The leadership now is with Dr. Sarah Ashcroft-Jones, who coincidentally was my undergrad student in Cambridge and now works with me as a postdoc. Many years later, we reconnected academically, and she's a tremendous early career researcher who had been through the program herself. So through that, she now has kind of a process she works on with the researchers in the program to talk about, topics, and some of the PhD students and postdocs can pitch ideas, and they have a process they run. For the ones that I'm directing now, and the ones that I did in the past, I essentially had a small number of people I went to talk about ideas for what would be good to run at this scale, what seems to be robust enough to test, what's worthwhile to test. And there was kind of a relatively smaller group, and you could tell how much value people placed in it by how many people signed up to be part of it, right? If people didn't see value in it, you kind of get the validation through, if you suddenly get, as we got in during the pandemic in 2021, the 200, I forget, was it 280 authors that we ended up having that year? I don't remember the final number. Maybe I'm exaggerating the number, but the discounting paper, we had hundreds, collaborators in so many different countries. I think we ended up with 65 countries or something along those lines. And, with that one, the value was seen by how many people not just agreed to it, but how many people wrote us when they found out about it, even though we weren't advertising it. So that can kind of validate that you're picking the right things. And so the process tends to be relatively small in terms of a small number of people who will ultimately be running it. I want to give, I recommend anybody who's interested in this work to go back and look at the names on our papers, particularly if they're in the first few authors or the last few, because those people put in a ton. I really want to stress, as much as I've directed and been out front, and I've tried to lead in every possible capacity, there are wonderful people that have put in a ton on this. Sarah's one now. We also have Sophia Pelika's a PhD student in Amsterdam right now. Previous year, Sandra Geiger, who's now at Princeton. She was doing her PhD. She worked in Vienna before. She and Bojana Vachkalov, who's also in Amsterdam, was in Belgrade before that. They have run previous years of these studies with us. Friederike Stock, who's at Max Planck in Berlin, works with two academics that are working on her PhD there. She led the study last year. So we have really good people also leading these with us. And I think that's also where, I want to give all the credit to these wonderful people who've been on there for a while. And then one name you'll see on a lot of our papers is Hannes Jarke, who works in Brussels, but is also a PhD student at Maastricht in the Netherlands, was previously at Vienna as well. He has been a major key player, and sometimes say, well, what does he do? And it's hard to describe. I mean, he's like the producer when a movie. What does a producer actually do? I don't know. They make things happen. On top of being a good academic, all of these people make things happen with these studies. And they take tremendous coordination. You have to find time late at night sometimes to match other people's time zones. You have to be aware of what's going on. It's really a big challenge to get all those things lined up.
Yeah, it's funny. It's just, I'm always fascinated with these studies because it's, I think like my natural way of working is very much like me and one or two other people. Like, I just kind of do what I want to do. And sometimes you want to have collaborators. I mean, you usually have collaborators with that. But it's like very, very close and very small. And I'm always fascinated with these projects because obviously like I am increasingly interested in this, like, this question I think that everyone is interested in, right? Which is like, do these results hold if I tested somewhere else? How specific are these results? How well do they generalize? But yeah, it seems like, it's, I guess the reason that the papers we've discussed have such value is because it's so hard to do, right? It's so hard to get all of this together. So I'm always fascinated with like hearing about how it's done. But yeah, there's also no easy way, right? There's no like easy solution to this, right? It's just, that's kind of what you have to do.
Well, there are easier ways. If you're content just running a big scale study, you can take a survey, send it to a bunch of people and say, hey, go help us collect data. And if you want to translate it. And I think there are some that are like that. And in some cases, maybe that's enough if the question is simple enough. But then you tend to get the kind of samples we always got in psychology. One of the things that I want to just praise all the collaborators we've ever had. We put people through such a high level of precision. We are very pedantic when you collaborate with us. We give a lot of spreadsheets with fill this in and follow this. And we, Slack channels and email threads. Back in the day, we were using Facebook groups to communicate all of these things, right? It was a very different kind of time. But we are very pedantic to make sure to the extent that we can, things are not just translated, but culturally appropriate, linguistically appropriate. This is not always easy. There are words that don't exist between languages, right? How do you translate money values sometimes? We found a way that we just found, average income in certain countries, and then we worked from that rather than translating, here's the US dollar version. And that really doesn't work very well, we found. And it's been much better. Don't worry about converting it. Find the local equivalent and start with that number. And those kind of things have helped tremendously. But we get really, really pedantic with some of our people. And one of the great things about technologies where they are right now is we used to have to just kind of blind trust the translation process. But one of the great things now is there's tools that can rapidly back translate things to English for us. So whether we, at least as the central team, can check, exactly the way things were translated and how it back translated. And we actually have flagged issues after the translation was done. We've gone back to those teams and said, we're really sorry to annoy you, but this is what it says. Can you explain this difference, right? Or one of the big things, some countries, if you ask them how much you earn, people default to monthly after taxes. In other places, it's annual before taxes. In other places, I think Singapore, for example, they have this additional income that they might get from the government. Does that count as income? Right? Because if that's something that's roughly equivalent across people, do you count that because everybody has the same baseline? And what if individuals don't include that, right? Some do, some don't, right? So you have to have a really strong understanding of it. So it's a lot of being really pedantic with people and trying not to say, I'm not telling you how your own system works. I'm just trying to make sure that we've got it correctly entered into the method. So it's this level of commitment. I mean, it's very easy to criticize whatever random things come out in the end, but there is this extreme amount of worrying about minor details that go into running these large-scale studies. But it has to be that way if you want to get them right. If you believe they're going to be important, you really have to do them that way. And that's something we've really felt. And I have a limited amount of hair left on my head at a relatively young age.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely get the being pedantic about things, because I guess it's like 1,000 different decisions, and if all of them are slightly vague and not exactly what you mean, it's going to happen anyway. But if you don't try and control that, it just becomes something completely different in the end. I was slightly surprised when you mentioned that you use AI for the translation parts to check it, because I grew up bilingually, so I have tried some of these translation things, and they are getting incredibly good. But it seems to me still that like the nuances you're actually interested in is exactly the thing that it might not get, right? So like, isn't basically the translation system exactly not the thing for finding? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So this is actually a great question, and I think this is an important lesson that we've had that I'd gladly share with researchers on this. So we don't say. It wasn't, I don't know if AI is what I would call it. It's just better forms of Google Translate. You can call it AI if you want. But we tell people not to use AI when they do their translations.
Like DeepL or DeepL or whatever it's called, or what to use.
Well, it depends which. We have to use a few different ones. Sometimes it's just as simple as using Google Translate on Chrome, right? But to be clear what we do, we first check. We have a way that we set up, and we look at the way they directly translated everything so we can see them side by side. We then implement it into the survey bit. We take the survey as would a normal participant, but we use a tool that automatically switches it back to our native language, whatever the team member's native language is. And we just go through it. And if we see something that looks different, we simply ask the team, hey, can you just check that this is correct? Because the back translation shows this. 50% of the time, they say the back translation is wrong that we are seeing, and in fact, leave it that way. The other 50% of the time, they say, good catch, we'll modify it, right? So that's maybe a really good lesson if you're going to use those tools. Don't assume one way or the other. Just use that as a red flag to check, okay? We've all had it where we finished studies and immediately thought, oh, darn it, how did we not catch that? Or, something. We have one in our current thing. I regret not including a question. I was afraid that the survey was getting too long. And so I decided we just wouldn't include this one question that I really wanted in there. And now we have over 21,000 participants, and there's no indication that anyone thinks the survey is too long, and I regret not putting it in there, right? So you're not going to get it perfect. But the new tools at least help us. When we ran the study during the beginning of the pandemic, so summer 2020, I was in New York, the most shut down of all cities, I think, in many ways. And when New York reached what was called phase 2 of the reopening, you could now sit outside in small numbers at kind of cafes and restaurants. So I took my materials. I found the first place that I knew was open. And I went and I sat there for the better part of 4 days. And all I did was tap through every version in every language of the study we ran that year in all the different, I forget how many, I think 26 countries we did that. I don't remember how many countries we did that. Isn't it 26? 26 countries. And I just tapped through. And then I didn't have the translation tool. So I'm not only reading different languages, I'm reading different alphabets, right? I can read Cyrillic pretty well. My Spanish is decent. Okay, my European languages in broad, I can mostly get through fine. I spend enough time in enough countries that I can get. I don't read Georgian, right? I don't know the Amharic alphabet for Ethiopia, right? So I'm going through it, and one of the things that you find though is if you at least kind of frame yourself in and clue yourself in, you can spot things and you can see numerical things. Well, in the ones that use the kind of numeric system we use, some are a little more difficult. And you find that you can actually check those things. Having said that, I much prefer the technology we have now because it's going to do a better job of it. Because there were lots of times I found little things, you start learning a lot about languages and the way things are done. A lot of the language we work in are right to left rather than left to right. So you have to become more comfortable in these things. Again, I don't know if this is that interesting to a lot of people, but I certainly think the message around making use of the new technology to at least identify the possible risks. This is a major part of the unseen labor of studies like this, is the hours and hours you spend double checking, not because you don't trust your teams, but because those minor little differences could change the study.
Man, my Georgian audience is going to be very, very disappointed in your lack of the language. Right?
I now know a great deal about a lot of how Georgian linguistics looks. I still don't speak the language or can read the alphabet, but I at least had to learn a lot about it. It was great. Learning about Amharic as well, learning that I think at least 3 or 4 of the countries we work with don't use our calendar, that work on a completely different calendar. Right.
So which ones, which countries don't use?
It's a different year. I think it depends which country you're talking about. Because, for example, Iran does not use Gregorian calendar. I believe Ethiopia as well. So it's a different year. Right. So learning these things, it's very insightful culturally. Right. Even without leaving and going anywhere, you can get a great deal of cultural appreciation and understanding, a lot of these things. Thank goodness for universal time for airlines. Right? Or man, can you imagine flights and times and figuring out where things are? So,
yeah. To kind of, feels like a very, very broad and generic question, but what are the pros and cons of these big studies? I mean, I guess there's the obvious ones, right? I mean, which I guess I would say the obvious ones are, the con is all the effort you talked about and all these things that we just mentioned, and the pros are, the results you can get. And, I think those are the very obvious ones, but I'm just curious, is there anything that, people just don't see when they read a paper like that? And that, maybe you already mentioned some of the painstaking detail you have to go into that, just doesn't really apply to a study that's done in one country, in one place, in one language. But yeah, I'm just curious, is there anything that's I don't know, what should we know about those papers that we don't when we just read them?
Well, they're great. In my view, those papers have much deeper science than just large sample, many countries and all that. In all of those, it wasn't intended to be a bulk story, right? The prospect theory paper, I certainly feel like it added something in validating and really just giving essentially a modern update to what they did in 1979. But we also did original analyses in there and some original things, like I told you about the expansion from expected utility theory. But with temporal discounting, we also talked about the distribution of the effects, the links or the lack of links to economic circumstances. And we talked about the economic environment says a lot more than just income, right? Because if you're in an unstable economic environment, you're much more likely to have high rates of temporal discounting than someone who's low income in a much more stable economic environment. And those things are very insightful, and they expand beyond just saying this bulk study shows that this theory is okay. We weren't just trying to do that. That was never really the intention. The idea was if we could get more countries, a broader sample, more engagement, we have a better understanding of where the theory does and doesn't apply. In the discounting paper, we talked about this as the contours, right? No psychological theory is ever, in my view, ever intended or expected to be universally true, right? Even take something like personality, heavily studied, massive measurements, right? Detailed ones, lots of validation of different components of it, but never would anybody argue universally applicable. You're never going to take a personality measure and say, I can absolutely guarantee what this one person will do in this one instance, right? And it never should be. Right. And I don't think, I think in many cases, what was lost was people saw it as this big validation of those things. And that's great. I'm glad that in many cases they saw the validation of the concepts. But we went further and we said, where doesn't it apply? Like if you look at a lot of the prospect theory stuff, and there have been papers on this since, I believe by teams in Sweden, and they talk about even if prospect theory is good at explaining behavior, it doesn't explain the majority of people the majority of the time, right? And it talks about nobody universally fits perfectly in all 6 of the anomalies. And the same can be said for temporal choice, right? These intertemporal choice anomalies that we see. And I think that in our work, one of the big things is we weren't just trying to show this replication. We were expanding knowledge. And in my view, we were adding to as well. And I think that that's something that maybe the idea should be you should write that stuff separately, or else it gets lost in the mix. The downside of some of this coming out during the thick of the pandemic was that there was really no opportunity to go around and present, to engage, because the world kind of shut down for those opportunities. There wasn't really this way to engage that material. But certainly I think there's some really important scientific insights that came from that work that weren't as picked up on. I could go on about, the unseen labor. I don't want to complain about it though, because I feel like I imagine most people could probably grasp. I could make one gripe though. We did, and it relates to my earlier one. We did contact people that we thought were pretty critical of some work in the field, whether it was on the theoretical side of what question we were asking, or sampling and underrepresented populations and so on. And we got ghosted in a few instances, certainly a lot of non-responses at all, but ghosting more from people who at first showed interest and then just stopped replying entirely. But also we found that people who had been most critical of the absence of the sampling that we were doing weren't interested in contributing to it. They were interested in just complaining about it. And this has been really kind of, I think, detriment to the field. I'm not saying they had to participate in our studies. That doesn't, I don't qualify. I don't think that their views are qualified based on whether or not they collaborate with me. That's not what I'm saying. But it certainly was strange that they didn't seem in any way interested in supporting what was being done there, even recommending anyone. I would say that is something that I think people should be aware of too, is that some of the most cynical voices aren't actually that interested in contributing, it seems. They're very interested in just being cynical, which doesn't really apply to me. Part of the reason I chose my field was because I liked its idea of understanding a problem or an issue or an opportunity and saying, okay, what can we do, right? And what can we learn more about this? Griping doesn't get me out of bed in the morning.
That's a shame. I also don't. Sure, you can get annoyed by things very easily, but it just seems so exhausting to always be cynical. But yeah. So let's not do it. And the praise of the people we've worked with. People have come up with. We've tried to, because one of the things you can get lost in a sea of authors like we have. And one of the things we try to do is for people who do exceptionally important work, we try to highlight that. So, for example, Emmett Damage and Bojanovic Kalov came up with one of the data collection methods that we talk about. Hannes Jarke did as well. So we tried to name and give them that appropriate recognition, because people complain about absence of representation in studies, but they don't necessarily provide us pathways to improve on it. Well, these people have done that, and we really try to do that. And if you look at some of the countries we now have involved in our studies, these things have been really valuable. We've done a little bit less on trying to publicize those, because one of the things I was afraid of was we'd publicize these methods and then people would use them to do bad quality work. So, and that I think is an issue in our field. I've seen some large scale data collection done that I think, okay, but you have bulk data, but it's not necessarily a good study, right? And I think that's the number one most important thing I hope everybody understands. We invest massively and seek lots of input and feedback before we actually run a study. Because even with all of that, it can't be perfect. So if you start out just saying, well, here's the thing we want to run, everybody now run it, I think is a problem. I think what I hope people understand is we invest massively into getting, I can't say getting it right, because you can never guarantee that, and it's certainly self-assessing, but we certainly invest heavily into doing our best to get it. Maybe one question from the perspective. So, I'm really so now we obviously have these tools to get samples, right? Whether it be prolific, or there's also a new one I'm at least aware of called B-sample, where they're trying to especially get these the ones that are basically not covered widely by the many of the others. Is there any point in For example, when I signed up to be sampled, had a look what it looks like, just having a look, and there's a temptation to go like, what, I'm just gonna like test some people, some English speaking countries, let's say, around the world. Is there any point in doing that if you don't, unless you heavily engage with people in the country to, make sure that you're not doing anything silly? Because part of me feels like, it's very easy now to just, select a different country and collect a couple of participants. But I'm just not entirely sure what the value exactly would be of doing that if you don't know that place very well.
Sure. No, I mean, we do a big effort to make sure we have collaborators in and from the country. Sometimes we have collaborators from the country that aren't physically there at that time, but they're from that country. First is the ethics, right? How you handle the ethics says a lot. If you just do it and then roll it out, but you haven't even asked people, do they need to get a secondary ethics or something, and you're just working on it externally, I'm not saying there's no value in it. I would say that it'll be limited because all your limitations will be obvious. You asked it as an outsider, not knowing any of these. I mean, the simple adaptation I talked to you about is how people refer to their incomes, right? If you just say, what was your income? How do you even know how to translate that answer, even if you get it in a language you can understand, right? So I think there's a lot of that. Not having a local collaborator will also diminish a lot of your understanding of the way things are said and presented. Even the classic joke about the US and the UK is two nations divided by a common language, right? In the US, 70% is considered an average grade, right? In the UK, that's the line for a distinction at university level, right? So how those two things translate, if you ask people on a scale of 0 to 10, or 1 to 10, how do we interpret a 7 out of 10, right? That can be very different. And if you have no understanding of a place, I think you're going to be limited in that. Having said, I don't think it's zero value. I certainly think there's a lot of value. And additionally, if you use prolific or B sample, you're paying people. So at a very minimum, at least they're getting money for their time, right? If you are getting volunteer participants, I would hope that you've done a lot more homework at making sure this study is as close to perfect as it can be, or at least the best it can be, given resources, knowledge, expertise, and local collaboration. I think the history is a lot of, foreign researchers going into places, taking time of people, and then jetting off and then writing a one-author paper that required, 30 people to help put it together. This I obviously strongly disagree with, and we give authorship recognition to everybody who completes their contribution to the study. That's actually one of our harder issues. Have we over-included authors who maybe didn't do quite as much, even though they had some minor role? We rarely have an issue of missing people out. There have been a few minor situations over the years where there was kind of a gray area, should someone be included? But we make sure everyone gets included, and that's kind of part and parcel of, should you be running a study in this place if you have no knowledge of it? Well, if you're paying people for their time and you can ensure the ethics and the quality of the study, I don't necessarily think you shouldn't do it. But if you are doing that without any sort of cultural awareness or engaging a local collaborator of any kind, a representative of each place, essentially an ambassador for each country, you're going to have kind of the known unknowns. We know that we don't know how to interpret a lot of this information. And I also think you're missing out on the great experience it is to collaborate with people in different places and learn about stuff. Like the learning experience I get from collaborating with people and the way things are done differently is spectacularly informative. And some really interesting things I've learned in a lot of countries of what engages people. And finding this was, you find it even in your own country. There's parts of the country you may not realize engage in certain things in certain ways that you may not be aware of if you don't know anybody from that community. And so you're missing out on both that quality side of the study, but also just the chance to learn and figure these things out in the way that we are. And it can generate some frustrations, but also you get a great appreciation for the variety that exists in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I'm asking specifically is because we have, for example, especially we have have a student in particular who's really interested in this, right? And she really wants to do it. And part of me thinks why not? Why not pay people to take part in a study and then see what happens? We're not doing anything that's sure, everything is culturally specific, but we're not doing anything that's I would say in terms of the kind of studies you can do, it's a little bit more on the basic side with maybe fewer moving variables, let's say, than other things. But yeah, part of me also thinks like, yeah, interpreting then what we get is going to be basically impossible if you just don't know that country, other than it's different and far away. You know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that there's no problem. I think I have some bias in the situation, but I'm certainly encouraging the people of using those platforms, particularly if it helps them get solid samples and it pays people for their time in fair ways and they've gone through the ethics of it. I'm certainly in support of that. Where I just encourage it is that it doesn't preclude you finding somebody from that country who's willing to partner with you and make sure that the quality of that study is appropriate for that place.
No, of course, but it's more of a time issue, right? Like in an ideal world, of course you would do it, but in some it's like, we could just do it quickly and see what happens. But yeah, I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So at the end of each interview, I ask my guests the same 3 questions. The first is, what's a book or paper you think more people should read? Can be old, new, well-known, not well-known, just something you think people should check out.
So, the book that I always recommend to people who are interested in my field is, the funny thing is the author is, you're going to roll your eyes at how obvious the author is, but it's which book I recommend. So, a lot of people that will listen to this program will have probably read Nudge or will be familiar with Richard Thaler, right? And, I'm not here to criticize the book or anything, but I have long said that Misbehaving is the book that people should really read if they want to get excited about this field. Because if you want to really work in the field, I found Misbehaving much more valuable. And ironically, I read that book on a train in Switzerland a number of years ago and had already been, trying to think of different ways to apply some of the work that I wanted to do on, statistics, probability, and understanding, and thinking what, real world frames it went well in. That book was in some ways life-changing for me, even though I've stayed on the same trajectory. It gave a home, it gave this idea a home. And I feel like many people have read Thinking Fast and Slow. They've probably read Nudge or Predictably Irrational, or, these kind of, mainstream books that have done very well and, brought our field a great deal of, credibility and interest. And I don't think there's real problems that are noise or, going on. But for me, Misbehaving was the book that talked much more about the scientific topics that I was interested in. And it gave much better frame, because a lot of times people will ask me if I've read, a book or heard an interview about a topic. And I've always been more interested in the original article, because as an academic, I'm kind of interested in not the headline information, but the that pedantic stuff, those steps, the methods, the analysis, and all. And I felt I got that more from Misbehaving. So that's actually a book I have kind of long recommended to people. That if they really like this field, that's one I think that you'll walk away feeling a little bit more, okay, so these are the ways in which we see behavior understood as this scientific concept that we can understand and study, right? I've long felt that. So that would be my book. Is it book and article, or book or article?
Book or. Some people do both. Some people go on a whole list. It's, it's very open.
Yeah, there's a paper, I believe, in Perspectives on Psych Science by Craig Parks, I believe, years ago about prosociality. And that was if you're interested in kind of, personality in how it relates to who we are in the social domain, I always thought this was an amazing one, because he seemed to bring together decades of research into one paper, which I was amazed how he did this. And it basically talks about, the 3 kind of different ways we interact in society, the pro-social, the pro-self, and the competitor. I always thought this was a brilliant way of looking at this, and in this kind of frame that, we have people that really position themselves as what's best for society is best, is what I support. Then what is best for me is what I support. And then the competitor, which I feel we probably all are this at some times at least, which is I'm good with what is good for society so long as I come out in a good position from it, right? Which is like conditional prosociality, I guess. I always thought this was a great paper that I always recommend people to read, because it kind of takes psychological science and says, how does this apply as us as social beings? And so I always like that one. So sorry, I gave you one of each, but I didn't write two.
Totally fine. Funny thing is, I'm still, so again, like it's a very loose question. I'm still waiting for someone to recommend their own stuff. Hasn't happened yet. One day, I'm still waiting for that to happen one day.
One hopes that the previous hour of our discussion encouraged some people to read one of the 2 papers I've worked on, at least.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's, yeah. But yeah, definitely. I mean, so the misbehaving I read a while ago, it's one of those, it's funny because like I didn't really plan on working on decision making. It's not like some people have just always been interested in that topic. For me, it's something I just kind of somewhat accidentally fell into. So like I read all those things like before, right? So all the books you mentioned, I read them just like as a psychology undergraduate or like in my master's or whatever, right? But I think I should probably just reread them again now that I'm actually like, I've read the research that they talk about and all the context. I mean, so I really love the related book, I guess, is The Undoing Project about Kahneman Tversky's working relationship. And
sitting right next to my desk. So
yeah, no, I think it's I think one of the best scientific biographies I've read. I think it's great. But the others I haven't reread since, so that's going to be one that I should probably reread also.
I think if anybody's looking for movie ideas, they did The Big Short, great. They did Moneyball, great. Now do The Undoing Project. Those
do you know whether there's any? Because it does feel like a very obvious kind.
I don't know, but if anybody knows Michael Lewis's agent, there are definitely some academics that would back the idea of that one becoming a movie.
Yeah,
because Hollywood keeps doing franchises. I mean, why not just a Michael Lewis franchise? Like that.
What, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the Michael Lewis's stories universe.
Yeah, why not? Yeah. I'm not saying they have to do all of his books, but it seems like The Undoing Project. I think enough people would find that interesting enough, and certainly it ends with some very interesting, I don't know if plot twist is the right one, but you can pinnacle what happens after the book, So,
yeah, I was about to say,
anyway.
There's I'll link in a recent article about, I guess they call it Kahneman's final decision, right? Or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. That was very interesting. And yeah, I guess it's a little bit like A Beautiful Mind, where one of the big plot twists happens after a book that is full of it. Yeah. Anyway, the second question is, what's something you wish you'd learned sooner? This can be from your private life, from your work life, whatever you want. Are you willing to share something that, would have helped you out if you figured out a bit sooner? Maybe, however much you're willing to share, how you figured it out or what you did about it, or yeah.
I'll kind of change tones and speak on a more serious level. One of the things that I learned, and probably in 2020, it really came to a head because I realized, so like many PhDs and postdocs that came out during the recession and, finishing up 2009, 2010 was not a great time to be, looking for academic work in that time. It was a real challenge. And I think a lot of people feel it similar again today. What it meant, though, was a lot of time after, if you wanted to do academic research, and I had no intention of ever being an academic. I enjoyed the opportunity of doing the PhD, but I was more than content to leave academia at the time. It was only later that I realized, my passion was really studying and researching things, and I only learned that by leaving academia for a while. And I got these great experiences and other things. But one of the things that I think a lot of people would benefit from hearing is, we really burn ourselves out a lot in modern times with how much we work. We pour a lot of time into things. We do a lot of kind of thankless tasks that we're expected to do. And we do stuff a lot of times either because it feels like a requirement or because we think that we're contributing to something that, we think that what we're contributing to is important. We're helping other people out. We're putting other people's needs ahead, or we're putting institutions and so on. And one of the things I realized later, though, was I had burned myself out in many ways. I really pushed myself very far and spent a lot of time, nights, weekends, or even work time, prioritizing other things than what was most important. And then later on realizing that a lot of that time was essentially created its own burnout. Like you were doing all these things that was creating more things that you had to do. And a lot of it became in many ways, not just thankless, but stuff that you would think later, okay, well, now I've spent all this time doing that. I didn't get my primary, or didn't get my priorities done first. And I'm not focused, and my mind isn't focused on these things. And later you start getting kind of frustrated that you put all these time and effort and all of it. You're like, why have I spent so much time working on this? And then you realize you kind of did it to yourself, right? You said yes to things. You thought there was this bigger kind of objective or that you needed to help out these other things. And one of the things I wish I'd learned earlier was if you want to do something because you think it contributes or because you think somebody else will benefit from it or you think it will have some greater objective to it, do it for those reasons. If you ever expect some sort of return from it, if you ever expect anybody to pay it back or to show any form of like formal gratitude thing, if the only reason you're doing it is because of that, don't do it. You will burn yourself out and you will find yourself very bitter. You will find yourself very frustrated because one of the things that I noticed is that people are actually very quick to ask for favors. And even if they don't realize it, they tend to be pretty quick to say, oh, can you do this or help me with that? Or shoot a quick email that asks for something, not realizing that each one of those things is time. It's a finite resource. You have a finite amount of time. And I actually wished I had learned earlier that, things that you contribute to because you want to contribute to them won't as likely, at least in my experience, won't as likely burn you out or leave you frustrated and bitter because you wanted to work on them. There was no, I work on them because XYZ later down the line or some. If you do it because you think there's some benefit or payoff later, or you just, you think, you're going to help somebody, the chances are is you're going to find yourself frustrated later on because it doesn't mean the favor will be repaid. I'm not saying only do favors that you think you'll get repaid from. I'm saying do things because you choose to do them, because you want to do them. Not be really clear and honest with yourself, because there are a lot of things you get asked to do, especially in academia, that maybe down the line you think this will help out. People will ask you, and if you say yes, they'll continue to ask you, right? And I'm not going to use it like, I'll put boundaries or this, that. I just want to say, if there's one thing I've learned later that I wish I'd learned earlier, work on things or contribute time to things that you directly see the value in, you want to work on, whether they're altruistic and you're just doing them for the good of doing them, or because you see the value in them long term. If you think you're doing it because there's some payoff to you later on, don't do it. You will burn out and you will find yourself frustrated, because very rarely is anybody taking the favor from you or the work or time from you because they're thinking how they can repay you later, right? I don't mean to be cynical about it. I only mean that I did a lot of things where I really burned myself out trying to help out other people, only to realize it was not seen as some sort of engaged relationship in the way we were trying to help out. It was someone was just asking because I said yes, right? And I saw that as problematic, not because you should only do things if people help out, but because people take advantage of that. And I think people should be more protective of their time and be more comfortable saying no on things if it's not really something that needs to be done or something you genuinely want to work on or see value in yourself. That may be a roundabout way of describing all of that, but I actually realized much later on in my career that I spent a lot of time on things that fundamentally I just shouldn't have. And not because you need to be self-centered or anything, but simply because there are a lot of things people ask and they're not necessarily asking for anything other than they think you might say yes.
Yeah, if I can add one thing to that, it's that so you're describing mainly a situation where someone asked you and then, you did something for hoping to get something out of it at some point. The fun thing that I did in my PhD is kind of doing that to yourself, which is as fun of a version of that, where you do something and you think like, oh, this is then going to lead to that cool thing that I want. And even though you don't really like doing it. And obviously sometimes you have to do stuff you don't want to do. But I find it this question of like, am I actually interested in the thing itself or for what it might bring me is a pretty tricky thing to realize yourself, because it's, obviously everything you do can have a positive outcome, right? It's just not like it's one or the other. It's usually like it's always both present, and the question is more like because of which of these am I doing it? And it's not easy.
I think that, look, you hear horror stories about, someone was told if they will just teach this one class, we'll make sure that, you are a top candidate for the next opening we have or something. And it just never comes true. And you hear these kind of things. Now, that's an egregious one. But there's actually a lot of others where somebody is just, asking you for, where, your own students, you would likely help out a lot of things, proofread, application letters or give them feedback on their CV or things like that. Like that's the kind of stuff you should be doing if you're in a position to do it and help out with. It's the stuff that goes beyond kind of the standards of your job, that people will ask you to work on things. I mean, you burn bridges with people trying to help somebody else out, only to realize it was that somebody else that caused the problem, right? Somebody couldn't get some administrative paperwork or couldn't get this thing or that. And then you're sitting there trying to get this person to do it. And then you find out later that the reason why that it wasn't done is the person who asked you for the help didn't do their job, right? And these kind of things come up a lot. So all I would say is, if there's one thing I would have been more selective about things that I allowed to fill my day, because, they say it a lot now, make your priority the bulk of your day. Don't make other things the bulk of your day. And then when those other things are done, then you can finally focus. That is, I think, a common issue we all face. Okay, I'm just going to get all my emails done and then I'll sit and focus. But you've cognitively spread yourself so much, right? And one of the great joys I had during writing my dissertation, it's one of the few people in the world I think I loved writing up my PhD. Yes, it's stressful and it was time, but I got into a rhythm at one point. One of the critical things I learned was how to finish days and how to start the next ones without spending 4 hours doing random other things and then finding it impossible to get writing. And those kind of things, learning how to get that momentum is great, right? But a lot of it has to do with just knowing which things aren't a priority in your day. And just because other people want you to answer quickly doesn't necessarily mean you need to.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I'm also one of relatively few people who enjoyed writing his thesis. For me, it was this thing where there's nothing else to do now. I mean, I've got a week left now or something. I just have to finish it, and this is it.
I spent 10 days on a farm in Bavaria trying to get my head right. Helped out with farm stuff, and did random things around that I could help out with while I was there. Tried to get my head on right. Couldn't get the writing started. Found a few different mental tricks and guidances and things, and then suddenly something clicked, and I realized what was making it difficult for me to get going. Once I found that out, I was off to the races. I absolutely loved it after that.
Yeah, maybe the secret is just being in rural Germany. Maybe that sounds safe for me. Maybe that's the secret.
I didn't write a word of it there. I can tell you, I went there thinking I would get writing done. I went there thinking that's where I'd get my writing done. And it didn't work quite like that. But the headspace where I started realizing what was stopping me from getting that productivity came clear to me.
So if this is too long of a tangent, then we can stop it. But why were you in a farm in Bavaria?
So one of my closest friends from grad school, from when I got to Belfast, I did my PhD in Northern Ireland, Queen's University in Belfast. One of my closest friends, he is from the town about 60 kilometers north of Munich, in Oberbayern. So what they would say is the real Bavaria. I know lots of jokes from that region about other regions in Bavaria too, interestingly. They would always host me. I spent a lot of time there with the family, and they were wonderful people to me. And so I went, just happened to go. It was around the holidays that year. It was easier to get there and spend extra time than get back to the States in those days. I was a PhD student, didn't have an income. So I went there, spent time. I mean, I think in total I've probably been there 15 to 20 times, maybe more. So I spent a lot of time with him. They were close friends. He had gone back to Bavaria by that time to finish up at the LMU, and then ended up at Max Planck. So.
Okay, cool. Final question, and I don't know how different this is from I guess I have two questions that are always very similar. But the final question is, usually, so far it's always been advice for PhD students, postdoc, or people in that border. But now that I'm technically in the second year of my postdoc, I don't care about PhD students anymore. Now it's just postdocs. So I'm changing the question now. I guess the question's going to grow with my academic stature over time, or not. We'll see whether my academic stature grows. But any advice for postdocs?
Postdocs, yes, tons. I lived the misery life of the postdoc, and the postdoc life is highly varied, right? First thing is, are you on a project that you really love with an advisor that has your interests in mind, or are you just, a research assistant with a better title, right? And not all postdocs are the same. There's precarious contracts, there's stable contracts, there's ones where you're basically spending all your time trying to get the next grant or whatever. So not all postdocs are the same. So I understand that there are many different ways. Some have a lot of independence that are more like fellowships, and some are very directly tied to specific projects that they may or may not have much interest in. the strongest advice I can say is it can be a long road at that point, and it can be competitive. The biggest piece of advice I give all postdocs is make sure that if your intention is to stay at academia, you have essentially the business card paper. And what I mean by that is you want to have a study that is yours at some point. You just don't, the being named on 50 papers, I've noticed more and more, doesn't really advance in the way most people might think it would. In other fields, it might. In the social sciences, I don't think it really does. Granted, it is great to be part of collaborations. I want to strongly encourage it. I'm not saying don't do that. But what you want to make sure of is that you have one or two papers that really establish your work. Not necessarily what you want to do for the next 50 years, but so that people can understand it. Vague understanding of what your interests are doesn't really help in the career trajectory in most cases, because most departments aren't looking for a jack of all trades. They're looking for a hire that fits what they're looking for, right? So you don't want to be too spread out, and you don't want to be too, narrowed down into what you do, but really make sure that if you're working as a postdoc, you're advancing who you are, not just getting your name on things. So make sure that you carve out something that gets you that paper. Now, if you've got one from your PhD and you know that's what you want to get working on, then great. Or if you're working in a postdoc that gives you that, wonderful. But you will find that some of the ones that end up in circular and, talk about these people that are 5, 10, 15 years in a postdoc, a lot of it's because they had to jump project to project to project, never got fully sunk into any, and it becomes very difficult to break out of that loop. So I absolutely understand and empathize with getting caught in that loop. And also you'll get asked to do a lot more things because as a postdoc, it's assumed that because you have a doctorate, you can teach certain classes. Well, those classes teaching can be great, but it can also be difficult to establish yourself. So to postdocs, I would really recommend, making sure that you're establishing your credibility on a topic, right? On a thing that can be defined and not just going to the next thing. I was in a fortunate position that I could do a lot of different things as a postdoc. And so I was dabbling more so than I was being spread out. It was kind of my choice. I took on a lot of consulting work. I took on a lot of additional things. I did that by choice, but after a while I found it could also be a prism, right? You could end up in this thing where, okay, well, people will give you the things that they don't know who else can do it, but not necessarily the things that you want. And so you've got to be careful not to get caught in that cycle. But as a postdoc, the critical thing is, are you developing in the direction you want to go, right? So you don't want to get pulled too far away from what you want to work on or too far away from skills that you need to develop. That's a critical recommendation I would give to postdocs because, it was from, I went through that window of kind of working on different things, different grants, different roles. Some of which I had direct control over, but some which was a bit more precarious and varied. And it can be very messy if you don't have a path out of that, right? I did it by choice, but I think sometimes you can get wrapped into it. Also, a lot of postdocs, there's the temptation to say yes to everything because you think by saying yes will lead you to that next thing. It rarely does. That's a one I'd be careful of. Being really good at one or two things as a postdoc tends to be more valuable than showing that you've done 50. Right? Having a really good commitment to a small number of things. So that's what I would say as a postdoc.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I guess there's one thing that I always found slightly confusing is that there seem to be quite different assumptions about how much fun people are having as a postdoc since I've been asking that question, because a lot of people say yeah, man, it's really hard. And a lot of people say yeah, man, this is the best period of your career, right? Mm-hmm. And I always find that slightly confusing, but I think I understand it more now with your answer because I also am having a good time in my postdoc. I mean, obviously there is, this long-term looming stress of by certain years you should have, of course there's that, but I never quite understood the whole what's so terrible about it. But maybe it is because I'm working on the projects I want to work on that are a continuation of what I wanted to do before, and I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing. And I don't have to teach. I have a fellowship to do research, and I guess I am kind of doing research. I guess maybe that explains a little bit more. There's
that's a big part of it. So situationally is a lot. Who's supervising situation, the length of the contract, all of those things heavily vary, and the environment in which you do them, right? some people took the first position that they got offered because they were worried, and understandably worried about it. But that could also mean that they were in something where they were essentially being told what to do. So they'd gone from the stress of the PhD and owning the topic to now going back to no longer you're owning the topic, but you're expected to be better than you were, a few months ago. And that can be a real shock in some cases. And that, I think, that ownership is a big part. Owning what you're working on isn't true of all postdoctoral positions. And that, and also the people that are overseeing your work, are they invested in your advancement? Because if they aren't, that itself is a big challenge. And I understand that when I hire postdocs, I make sure that they are genuinely fundamentally interested in what we're working on, and make sure that the level of autonomy they have is at least enough to keep them feeling motivated about the work. Because if you're babysitting, nobody likes it, right? It's very different when the PhD, you think you're done. For a lot of people, if you get a good postdoc, it's great because you no longer have to worry about the defense. You're now doing research. You're not strategizing a degree and a diploma, right? And, I loved my PhD. I worked very intensely on it, but I also knew that at some level I had to know the critical thing, though, is that you have to pass these guidelines other people have given you. When you're doing your own research, that's not the case anymore, right? Because it's yours, right? Not to say that mine was guided. I want to be very clear. Mine wasn't overly strategized. And in fact, my supervisors would have told you it wasn't strategized at all. But it is a different kind of feeling when you're doing the research, and it's not just I need to get this degree finished and pass this defense, right?
Yeah, I like the part you said about the ownership of the project, because it's like, whenever the project gets to an annoying point where you go like, oh, why am I doing this? This is silly. It's like, oh, because I thought this was a good idea. That's why, you can't like blame someone else for that stupid decision. It's like, oh, that wasn't I literally applied to do this. I would like I applied to get money to do this. So yeah, it kind of eliminates some of those like.
Yeah, and one would wonder if you were miserable for a project that you described. It's a slightly different situation. Yeah. I mean, in some cases, it can be over passion. I mean, there's that whole thing of, if you're extremely passionate about it, you end up burning yourself because of it, right? The guy that solved Fermat's theorem, right, locked himself into an attic, and his family was trying to force him to eat by sliding food under his door. Those kind of things is probably not what I would recommend to most people. But those kind of stresses as well. But otherwise, normally you would expect that people who are self-choosing the research should be generally happier in those roles. And if you get a postdoc like that, I mean, that's beautiful, especially if it's well-funded, isn't too short of a timeline, and so on.
Okay. Well, on that hopeful note, positive note, those are all my questions. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.